Massive thank you as always to our top tier patrons Sarah Turner and Alexander Lashley. For as little as $3 you can gain access to Patreon only episodes as well as access to our Discord server where we host weekly live discussions with host Ikoi Hero and myself. So if you like what you hear, come join us at patreon.com/it's not just in your head. Please do rate us on Apple Podcasts and follow us on social media. We're on Reddit, TikTok, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And if you have any questions or comments about this episode or the podcast in general, then email itsnotjustinyourhead@gmail.com. Today, we're joined by Douglas Rushkoff, author of the new book, Survival of the Richest. Douglas is a media theorist, writer, lecturer, graphic novelist, and documentarian. Alongside the likes of David Graeber, MIT listed him as one of the world's most influential thinkers. And this was a fun chat. I hope you like it.
In the mental health field, too often, we've made it seem as if it's just in your head. Just in your head.
The landlord can hijack the rent by 20%. That impacts people's mental health.
We can't have a profit-driven mental health care system if we want our people to be connected and healthy.
Presumably, you've already done some media stuff around this, or you're doing it. So I don't know how much you feel like, you're just repeating yourself. But I think certainly...
I haven't. I haven't even figured out. I'm going to try not to figure out talking points for this one. For the other books, I've developed. These things. I've got like a 30-second way of talking about it, and a 60-second way, and a 90-second. And I don't even think that's a good idea. Like the better I get at describing a book in 90 seconds, the less need there is for somebody else to read it,
Sure. Yeah. That's a really good point.
And it's also, I've been doing this for so long. I really want to see if I can just be. In other words, if I can be non-strategic and see these engagements less as opportunities to sell the book rather than what I get for having written the book. So I've got and it's too late. What am I going to do? Sell more books and get more money and get, it's whatever. I'm being way more Buddhist and in the moment about it.
But I like the thing in particular that in writing these books over the years, how that has, as you mentioned, this feedback process later in the book anyway. But it's just that all these, tech millionaires, billionaires are ultimately approaching you because of, stuff that you wrote a while ago. And it's given you this sort of fascinating insight into their world to some degree. And your sort of opening story is kind of amazing because you've essentially been to the James Bond layer, or layers, I should say. Like, I don't know if you wanted to sort of just briefly talk about the thing that kicked writing the book off, because it's a sort of fascinating story or situation to find yourself in.
Yeah, it's funny. And I didn't even think of it as that big a situation. I wrote this Medium piece about kind of the human psychology of, I was raised to believe that, if you live in a bad neighborhood, what you should do is try to make enough money so you can get out of that neighborhood, right? and get to a better one. And I was trying to write this article where I was saying, no, that's not going to work anymore. That you've got to actually use your time, energy, and money to make the neighborhood that you're in better. Because ultimately there is no other neighborhood, in the end. And then as an example of it, toward the end of the piece, I was saying, and I just came back from this weird thing. I thought I was going to go do a talk about the future of the digital economy for these, bankers and investors. And instead of it being this talk, they brought 5 men into the dressing room, into the green room, who sat around this table, and they're like, this is it. There is no talk. There is no auditorium. There is no room. You're in it. And it was these 5 billionaires, or 3 definite billionaires and 2 very close to billionaires, if not billionaires by now, who were, peppering me with all of these, very binary questions about the digital future. And they were kind of just nibbling on the edges until they finally got to the topic, which was they wanted advice on their doomsday bunkers. And do I put it in New Zealand or Alaska? And these crazy ass questions about their preparations for what they saw as the inevitable decline of Western civilization, a pandemic, or an electromagnetic pulse, or a revolt, a revolution of the masses. And the question that we spent the majority of my hour with them on was, how do they maintain control of their security force after their money is worthless? So in that sort of the apocalypse vision, they've brought in these Navy SEALs to protect them and their families and their compounds. But why do those Navy SEALs continue to risk themselves for the billionaire once the billionaire's money, is no longer spendable? And it was a very weird time. And I guess it set me off on this journey to figure out how had, the wealthiest, most powerful people that I'd ever met, the wealthiest people in the world, why did they feel so utterly powerless to do anything but try to escape from the disaster of their own making? And how had they brought themselves to believe that with, enough money and technology that they could somehow successfully insulate themselves from the reality they were in themselves creating by earning money in that way?
Right. And yeah, they laughed at you, right? Because you're like, just treat your staff like nice now, right?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of joked to the guy, in a nice kind of Woody Allen fashion. I said, you want your head of security to be nice to you in the apocalypse. Pay for his daughter's bat mitzvah today. And the joke being that I somehow imagine most Navy SEALs, don't have daughters getting bat mitzvahs. I don't see them as part of the 2%, but of American Jews. But besides that, it was right. It was saying, I was trying to help them understand that if you are really engaged with them as a human being now, then they're not going to be able to pull the trigger on their ray gun or whatever, or strangle you or steal your stuff later. And hopefully, if they begin treating their head of security that way, that would trickle out to the way they treat everybody. They would start to see their employees and their customers and the communities in which their companies function as the human beings that they should be nice to, rather than just their Navy SEALs.
Yeah, but as the Amazon model shows, and as Emily Gindelsberger's book On the Clock, 5 biggest or the 4 biggest employers in the United States show, that they just want more now. Maybe that's a long-term concern, but the moment is more me now.
Yeah, well, and that's been really since capitalism, and
yes.
since in some ways, since the Enlightenment and the invention of the individual. I mean, it was a beautiful kind of, neoclassical idea that here I am, this individual, and, but it's doom for community or society. There is no, I don't want to get into the psychology of it, but, I don't even know if Freud helped us on that level. Not only are you an individual, but there's an individual inside you that you can't even know who's driving all of your stuff. It's like, oh, great. And I don't think we can continue to understand ourselves as individuals. Somehow, catastrophism and individualism are dovetailed. They're married to each other in a way. And if you stop thinking of yourself as an individual, then you're no longer looking at how do I survive and compete against the other ones, but rather how do I, how am I responsible for the community, and how is the community responsible for me? And this, in America today, or even in Silicon Valley today, that sounds like communism or heresy of some sort, and that's
yes.
a shame.
It does, although on the other hand, there are books like The Lonely Century, in which loneliness is also defined as social. Isolation from belief that your government will protect you, or that you have any protection at all, which is where I think America is as our empire collapses and people are bereft. Not protected from disease or economic downfall. and watching these giants become ever more bloated at their expense.
Yeah. Well, individualism sold more products to more people in less time, right?
Yes.
If everybody has their own lawnmower and is an individual with a lawnmower, you sell more lawnmowers. So both capitalism and technology have been pushing us towards greater levels of individualism, whether it's the financial community convincing employers to let go of their collective pension funds and have everybody get their own financial advisor and their own 401k plan, where you're now competing against everyone else in order to have an individual nest egg that's enough for you to survive the rest of your life once you can't work anymore. Or technologies that, were originally what made them so exciting was that they were networked and communal and involved sharing and connecting. And now we have iPhones and iPads, not Wii phones and Wii pads. These are, it's the individual looking at his phone, and any connection you have to anyone else is highly mediated by your little personal accounts. It's never a group of people.
No, it's sort of cute that in the United States, post-World War, as the anti-communist crusade tried to detract from the fact that our ally was, quote, Uncle Joe, Stalin, and the United States and the Soviet Union won World War II, they put Joseph McCarthy of anti-communist fame. He was the head of the housing committee, which decided to invest hugely, not in the cities where people share collective washing machines and grounds and other things, with the idea that the collective equals communist, but instead subsidized places like Levittown, where everyone has their own little cubicle and their own GE appliance and their own driveway and their own car rather than mass transit. It was a whole deliberate anti-communist crusade against communality, which now is terrible.
Right. But it was well-meaning if you think about it. I mean, at the time, you had psychologists and people like Margaret Mead and Gregory Bateson consulting to FDR, and they were really concerned about all these men coming back from World War II, all traumatized and crazy, and we can't let them gather, and talk with each other. They're going to create gangs and movements. So let's give everyone a piece of land and a mortgage and a home and a wife and keep them apart. And let's do, suburban planning that has no communal areas, nowhere for people to gather, so that they thought it would make people happy.
Right. I guess, maybe I feel like there was definitely a mendacious aspect to that rather than a well-meaning aspect to that.
Mm-hmm.
Because even suburbia, it's funny. I remember having I can't remember. Is she was from one of the Scandinavian countries, but she was doing a postdoc in at UCSD locally. And I just remember briefly, she lived pretty close to me. And so one day she wanted to drop something by the house. And, when I was there, she was just like, oh, yeah, the houses are kind of like, spread apart. And, do you know your neighbors? Do you know your neighbors? And I was just like, I actually don't really know. I really don't know. I mean, I wave to them, but we don't really communicate that much, in all honesty. And she just kind of looked at me and she was like, but how, I don't understand. She was like, well, it's like, if you don't know your neighbors, how do you borrow things?
Right.
Well, you don't want people borrowing things. I mean, and then on what you're talking about,
and that's the thing is
buy a new one.
Right. Well, I guess it's, where she lives, it if one guy on her block owns or a couple of guys on the block owns the lawnmower, it's just kind of assumed.
Right.
that like they'll lend it out to you and you don't have to buy one, but instead you'll buy something else that, you know, the people on your street don't have. And then
Right.
share that with, you
Right.
know, and so she was just kind of like, so how do you get things done? Like, how do things get done? You know?
Right. But then what you got to then look at is the fact that, okay, so now you've got a generation or two of technology developers who've grown up in that world with those values. And when you're born into a world with those values, you don't see them as social constructions. You see them as just, that's the way things are. So if you see that as nature, as human social reality and the way things are, and now you're building the next landscape, you bring along those values with you. You know, those are underlying assumptions of social media. Those are underlying assumptions of the business plans of these companies. So now you take that isolationism and individualism and extractive capitalism, and you dose it with digital steroids, and you get, you know, an exponential version of the same old social and cultural features. So what I'm looking at is, you know, here are these dudes who are happy to disrupt a particular market. I'm going to disrupt the book industry. I'm going to disrupt the taxi industry. But none of them are willing to disrupt the underlying assumptions of extractive corporate capitalism in order to explore whether there is a more distributed paradigm that would not require them to earn so much money that they have to literally escape from the planet.
Yeah, but their system has also benefited them, unlike the masses. And I just want to say, because I'm old, when I was young, which was, you know, post FDR, FDR hired all sorts of socialists and communists and had a communal vision in many ways with his big projects and Social Security, unemployment insurance, and all of those things. And it was the capitalists' revenge that changed that, because FDR taxed them at 96.8% in order to fund those projects during the Depression. And I remember, because I lived in Manhattan in an apartment building as a very little girl, just going around the building. My mother wasn't particularly interested in us, and me and my sister went and visited the neighbors. Everybody's door was open because it was also before addiction, so people didn't rob each other. And we came around and visited. There was a different culture, which was changed with the anti-communist crusades. And of course, those people can't envision an alternative. They made billions on individualism.
Well,
it will have to come from below.
Here's an interesting, maybe tension, but I think one of the things you identify in your book is this sense of, again and again, this idea of control and of planning. And like you said, underlying assumptions, really. It's like how humans are. And, you know, there's historical examples there with the birth of public relations and Edward Bernays and sort of controlling the population through satiating their desires through products and stuff like that. But it all comes from that sort of, we know best, right? Like we're the chosen ones. We know how to direct or control a population. And what's interesting is that I guess in some of that example you're just giving, Harriet, you could say that same chain of thought was happening there, right? That FDR or whatever was like, and his crew were like, we know best, we'll do X, Y, Z.
Yes.
And so, and to my mind, even though, like you're saying, that it had positive ramifications, I think that the principle is wrong. That,
yes.
That like a small group of people should be deciding anything for everyone, right?
Right.
Well, we'll see. You know, this was, Walter Lippmann was a great progressive in the early 20th century. And a progressive in most of the ways that we understand progressives. And then when Woodrow Wilson, who had ran on a peace platform, wanted to get America involved in World War I, He hired Walter Lippmann and Lippmann's protege, Ed Bernays, to start the Creel Commission, which was developed to convince America to go to war. And Walter Lippmann, a well-meaning, if deluded, progressive, wrote this book, Public Opinion, where his model of government was based on the idea that the people are just like the people in Plato's cave. They're just responding to the pictures in their heads. And whoever can put the pictures in their heads controls the actions and beliefs of the people. So he thought what we have to do in order to have a functional democracy is have government gets a council of experts who are in like a building next to the White House somewhere, scientists and mathematicians and social scientists. They figure out what's the best policy for America. They tell it to the president and the politicians who agree to put it into law and execute it. And then the president and the politicians tell it to their public relations council, who convinces the American public, who manufacture consent for the policy that we know to be good. And it's a pretty dark vision. And John Dewey, the guy who was running Columbia Teachers College, started writing these letters, these public letters to Lippmann saying, oh, no, you're wrong. And, we just need a good press. We need good education. And I like to believe that, no, we can educate and people can rise to the occasion of democracy. But when I look outside and I see, I see more people being activated to vote by Fox News and truly crazy talk than by the basic American progressive values or democratic values, even when people are willing to vote for the idea that a legislature should be able to to be able to overturn the public will in an election. I think, well, maybe Lippmann maybe he had a point. Maybe
Right.
We are not up for this.
Well, this is one of the things that has been previously discussed on the podcast with Alfie Baum and the other recently with Jason Miles. This idea of like there is nothing but propaganda, and that's the only game in town, so you have to play it. And what do you think? Is that just like depressing, or is it like, okay, that's...
Well, again, you only have to play it if people are living more in the image space than they are in reality. So, that's the horror of a digital society, is that digital is really just a symbol system. Digital is not real. Digital takes everything and turns it into symbols. I mean, even to some extent, when you listen to an MP3, you're not listening to a song. You're listening to an algorithm that is creating the illusion of that song in your ears. It's not music anymore. These are symbols. It's digitized. It's quantized. So when you live in a digital world, or as Borston or Neil Postman would have said, an image-based world of television, you're no longer in on-the-ground reality. So yes, in that case, propaganda is going to matter more to people than their lived experience, because they are living their lives in the propaganda space, which is why I wrote the book before this, Team Human, to tell people, no, read your Levinas. Not the public, but you guys, make face-to-face contact with the other. That's where you are the most human. And, once you're doing that, once you are recalibrating your psyche, with other people in a social reality, then propaganda gets much, much smaller, because your lived experience is irrelevant to these messages about, building walls to keep Mexicans and Muslims. And, it's not real anymore.
Right. And sorry, Harriet, go ahead.
One of the things that's happened in the United States is that the media is a capitalist controlled media. So if you want to get another view, you have to find it on the internet. But since advertising runs stations and newspapers, you cater to those people who pay for the ads, and so that they decide your reality. And so that people have to look for another reality. And ironically, in terms of what you're saying, the only place they can look in the United States is the internet, because it won't be in the dominant reality that is really shaped by capitalist need. They don't have to have dictatorial regimes telling you. They just have to have you go where the money is. So that's another tweak.
Right. Well, and it's also one of the reasons I think why conservatives take such, focused interest in education and education content.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if you look at, local elections, especially around school boards, you tend to see just a lot more enthusiastic conservatives running for those positions, oftentimes. And I mean, that's, if we're going to talk about the Roe versus Wade kind of sideline over here, the abstinence only education was a huge part. The abstinence only sex ed was a huge part of the general erosion of reproductive rights, and also just like basic knowledge, right? Like if people, like when I was working with younger people, like the people that could elucidate the difference between a birth control pill, a morning after pill, and pills used for abortion, like very rarely could people tell me the difference of those three. And these were women.
Right.
Yeah, but we have two corporate capitalist parties. So there really is no antidote. I mean, if you look at what's happened in France now, where the left has unified and actually captured a majority of parliamentary seats, you see a much more collectivist vision, and you also see a people that always had political alternatives. America, that touts democracy all the time, doesn't have that. Not only don't we have democracy and co-ops at the workplace, which is an option in Italy, but we don't have democracy in terms of choice of system, only in choice of tendency. So they both support one another, and there is no vigorous opposition, which you can see with Biden. A client of mine came up with a beautiful, accurate analogy with the last huge mass shooting. And it was that in Uvalde, Texas, that the shooter is the Republican Party. The police who stood around for an hour and covered their ass while 21 people were murdered is the Democratic Party. And the people where Biden came to speak that screamed, do something, and didn't allow his thoughts and prayers, that's the rest of us. Because the social fabric in America is torn. The American dream is gone. If you work hard, you're not going to get ahead, and people are abandoned. And so there is this dawning realization we've been had without a real political alternative.
But I think I also
societies have.
I also think that that's exactly what the billionaires are feeling as well, though, right?
Sure.
Which is just that there, like you say, the social fabric is torn. Let's get the fuck out, right? Let's escape
individually.
And I thought the recounting of the Leary thing, saying about all these tech people just want to recreate the womb, was fascinating. Because he called it years ago, right?
Yeah, it's interesting from that, because was a mental health professional in his day. Although I guess some of his methods were questioned. He had a psychologist's view of humanity. And when he read Nicholas Negroponte's book about the Media Lab, or it was Stuart Brand's book about Negroponte's Media Lab, I was with him when he read it, and he was reading it really fast and writing in it. And I thought he was all excited about, the description of MIT and what they were doing in the new computer age in the late 80s. And when he was done, he threw the book across the room and he went, blah. And I was like, what? And first thing he said, only less than 3% of the people in the index are women. That's how you know they've got a problem. And then I was like, really? And he said, yeah. He said, these guys with their technology, they're trying to recreate the womb. They They clearly had mothers who they believe couldn't anticipate their every need, and they still resent them, and they want to recreate a womb and to use technology to be that mother they never had, who would know, through algorithms, would know before they did, that they needed changing, or that they need sex, or that they need food, and he thought they were doomed, that they were going to use technology rather than connecting with other people, they were going to use it to return to a kind of a fetal state of being sustained and nurtured without the human. I mean, and that's sort of the track that I'm following is, starting with Francis Bacon and before, this idea, these, male scientists looking at science and technology as a way to contain and control nature and women and how scary they are. I mean, even what you're talking about with reproductive rights, it's a misogyny that's at the base of a lot of what's happening. I was just listening to someone who was talking about the history of public pools in the U.S. It was Tucker Carlson got on this for some reason, and what they're so confused. They the reality of the history of public pools is they were interracial and there was no violence. It was only when they became co-ed that they became violent, that white and black boys started fighting. So what was that? That's misogyny. It was the white guys upset that black guys are looking at their women, is what led to the violence, not the actual black and white people being together. And, and the only reason you're going to be fighting over people looking at your women is if you see them as your women, right? As if you have an essentially misogynist understanding of women as property. And so it's it's really interesting. I mean, I know it doesn't have a whole lot to do with billionaires escaping the planet, but it does have to do with these dudes, and it is guys, fear of women and nature, and the idea that they're going to use money and technology to somehow protect themselves from the unpredictability of real life, and particularly, women and children and plants and different things, as if that's a problem. And that's where they come from. It's where science and math, we're living in a world that's increasingly ruled by statistics. That's what algorithms use, is statistics. And they're trying to make choices for us based on statistical logic. They'll say, look, there's only a 5% chance of you succeeding if you do that. Come on, do the 95% thing. But real life is based on that 5%. Life itself is so unlikely. Humanity is so unlikely. Mozart was so unlikely. It's people venturing into that unlikely 5% probability space that sustains the species. It's those few little drones that look for another beehive. And so if we auto-tune those out of existence because of our fear of women, basically, and our fear of nature, we will all die. We will get that brittle society that we're moving towards. So that's why I'm saying, not worry about politics. Yes, vote and all that, but don't look. When you draw that, or your client made that analogy between the mass shooting and the Democratic parties. Don't go there. That's not our world. The real world is right here. You can help your neighbors. You can do mutual aid. You can do local food pantries. You can tutor underprivileged kids without government approval, right? We can make society more resilient from the bottom up, whether or not there's a fascist in power. Yeah, it's harder. It's harder if there's fascists in power, but it's not impossible.
No, but I also think that it's very important in this misogyny that what they are doing is degrading caring labor, because women have not only been the ones to create life, but also to nurture life And by degrading the female sphere and giving it over to male judges and doctors, you take it away from women, which is the power of another economy, the economy of caring. And I think it's very telling in our society that we really don't have any way of calculating the worth of the essential labor of caring.
And that's the question, and I talk with Riane Eisler a lot about this. She wrote The Chalice of the Play and The Caring Society, and she talks a lot about, creating a new kind of GDP or GNP or new set of metrics that take into account everything from, toilet training a child to raising them to not kill people and all. And while there is economic value to it, I have almost the reverse impulse, which is rather than to put all of the complexity of human behavior and caring and nurturing on the books, let's take more stuff off the books. In other words, it matters whether or not there's a metric for it. It matters. So I'm trying to get people out of the, like Jaron Lanier, a great technologist, wants us to use blockchains to record everything, get everything, because all of it's useful and everyone should be compensated. And I'm like, maybe we should move out of the compensation mindset and people start doing things for their own sake. So you start looking at your long-term security less as how much money, how much has been calculated that I did, and rather how well have I integrated myself into a community so that it will naturally want to take care of me as I get older.
Yeah, that's very un-American.
It's like an alternative theme song.
One of
Go on, sorry.
One of the issues with capitalism is that it ultimately disadvantages everyone, because it's not just men that actually do well. It's a very specific subset of well-to-do men. One of the major issues of it has been like this complete and utter wasting of the collective talent of people.
Yeah.
Through the lack of you see 3-year-old kids, you do not see an uncurious, unenthusiastic child at that age. And you nurture and you're able to nourish that as a society. You would have, like Mozart, I don't think wouldn't be a rarity, necessarily if you were really. I think capitalism actively denies people their talent. And how do we as a society change that, Because a lot of it isn't just like tutoring, kids in disadvantaged neighborhoods. It's like, what are we tutoring them on,
Well, again, it comes down to the metrics thing, though. I think particularly in the education stuff, we had we did a podcast recently with Derek Vaughan. He was talking about the state of education, having been a public school teacher for a long time. And obviously it's just all these, as you were saying, sort of Douglas, these ideas of metrics and how they're just gamed and how the whole thing is just sort of a house of cards in many ways. And so I do think, I ultimately agree. Some things just should not be getting measured. And I think to some degree you can look at a lot of the schooling stuff as like what happens when you measure shit that maybe is not worth measuring.
Right, because nobody's measuring also for enjoyment and fulfillment.
Or connection.
And connection and curiosity and nobody's measuring, people being inspired and curious.
This is also why I think there's crossover ultimately in what Douglas has written about and ultimately your roles as therapists, because ultimately you are dealing with people who are human beings and they're complicated and they're not a 0 or a 1. They're this sort of massively complex emotional being, and they don't fit into these boxes. And in your therapy space, you have your insurance forms and you have to like classify people. Like it it is exactly the place where the classification to some degree falls apart, I imagine.
Totally it does. But I also think that there's another element we have to figure in, which is if the capitalist world only rewards the person at the top, like Elon Musk, where thousands of other learnings have contributed to his electric car and only he gets the billions, then you don't celebrate the collective effort that got you there. You just celebrate the person who ripped it all off and monetized it, which is absolutely destructive of everyone's creative impulse. Everyone else has been had.
Yeah, I mean, so you look at Jeff Bezos sending his Blue Origins spaceship up. He basically did what John Glenn did in 1963 or something. Right. And I saw the CNN and MSNBC people there just giddy that this man had done this thing, and they were not celebrating humanity making it to space, because we did that 60 years ago. What they were celebrating was an individual had enough money to get himself into space. And and I know there was problems with NASA.
Not very far.
Right, not very far. I know there's problems with NASA, and it was motivated in part by a false race with the Soviet Union, who we thought were going to put a sickle on the moon and all that. But all that aside, it was still, getting to space was still a collective achievement of us as a nation and us as a species. One small step for mankind, which should have been humankind, but we didn't have,
of course,
humans yet.
Right. Yeah, women weren't invented at that time.
No, they weren't invented yet. You were still just a rib.
Right.
Yeah, but it's odd, but that is the tech bro Silicon Valley mindset that I'm trying to counteract here. This idea of the individual escaping. First, there is no individual. Second, there is no escape. And once you realize that, it's the same as in therapy, I would think, and I've read a lot about Anna Freud and her efforts, her, again, well-meaning efforts to turn lesbians into straight people so they wouldn't have to suffer at it. And there's the idea even, and get therapy. People should get therapy. We owe ourselves therapy and all that. But the idea that it's my job to fix myself, to somehow adapt to this. Every therapist these days wants to become a social worker. And that means not to socialize the individual, but to socialize the society in which this canary in the coal mine is having an appropriate emotional, psychological response, to a world in which we're being alienated from one another. There is no Lexapro for this. There's not. And so it's like, this is, yes, it's become a mental health crisis, but it's a society in crisis. And the only way, yes, we can try politically and to do movements. And I believe in, movement politics to some extent, but there's the immediate alternative is for people to drop out of that, go as local as you can, be as social as you can, understand that no, degrowth is the future. It's not about growing the economy. It's about degrowing the economy so we use less energy and maybe can survive. You are allowed to do less. And every minute that you spend just looking into someone's eyes or walking with somebody, holding hands, you are an enemy of the state, right? You're an enemy of capitalism. When you do, just play cards with somebody, and you are not obligated to keep the market going. Human beings are not here to fuel the economy, but the other way around. Can we pause 1 sec? My daughter's calling on the phone.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah. No worries. Yeah, there's a lot of notes I have from the book, and if we have 13 minutes left, we obviously aren't going to be able to get through them all, but that's okay. It's been a lot of fun.
It's a very lively discussion.
Yeah, he said something very funny about TED Talks, which I sort of wanted to riff on as well.
It's interesting with TED Talks. They asked my husband, who's a Marxist, to give a TED Talk on what is socialism. He gave a very articulate talk, and they didn't publish it.
Right. Well,
of course.
That massively fits with his take on it. That's amazing.
Yeah, because they're selling these TED Talks.
Hey,
you see, you're the only people I would have actually, in a podcast, felt it's okay to respond to my daughter who's on her lunch break from her summer school thing. But I mean, you know what I mean? But that's because you're those people. You're these people. But that's what I'm it's like, how hard is that? How hard is that? It's like, it's funny. When I graduated college in 1983, when there was some kind of recession thing going on, so we couldn't get jobs.
As usual.
We didn't even really want jobs so much. What we wanted was what we called Slack. I don't know if you guys are familiar with Slack, but it was you just
give me some Slack.
Give me some Slack. Exactly. It's all you want is Slack. So you earned money. If anything, you earned money only to get yourself some Slack elsewhere. So I used to type. I knew how to use computers. So I would go into a law firm at night and listen to depositions and type them into a word processor, for like $30 an hour, which was insanely good money in 1983. So I could do that 2 or 3 nights a week. And the rest of the time, do weird ass theater experiments. And I didn't care. Where are you going? What are you doing? What are you developing? What are you going to be when you grow? Whatever.
Yeah.
I just want more Slack. And now I'm looking back on that not as the most enlightened path I ever took through life.
Except people are also scared about the future. Yeah. However, 20 million Americans have dropped out of the labor force, which is very much along your lines, because they think, what is the point of setting myself up to make other people money where I am disrespected? Screw it. I'm getting Slack.
You mentioned in your book about the same thing happening in China.
I appreciate you. You're the one who keeps trying to get everyone back to the book. You are a sweetie pie.
Yeah.
It's thanks, Liam.
No, it's all good. It's just I definitely really enjoyed it, and I'm sort of very excited to talk about various different parts of it. But I think you mentioned the lying down thing in China, which I hadn't come across, which was exactly that, right? A protest.
It's a protest movement. They just lie down. Young men who don't want to work, they lie down in the street or on the sidewalk. It's a movement of resistance where they're just like, no. This doesn't, what am I supposed to do? Go into a factory for 3 cents an hour and clean iPhones with a toxic solvent that's there just to remove all trace of human fingerprints from the phone before it goes to the American that bought it, leading to fetal deaths and all this. These chemicals are so bad. It's like, and they're just like, forget it, because we don't actually, right now, we are no longer working in order to create the stuff that people need to live. We are working in order to justify our share of the spoils of capitalism. So we've got to wind this thing down. Go to the 4-day work week, the 3-day work week, things like UBI or universal basic assets even. We are constitutionally incapable of reaping the harvest, and all we can do is burn. We are. It's funny. I read a lot of Torah, and there's a lot of times when people are doing sacrifices to God, and they burn a goat or something, and I look at something like Bitcoin, and I say, oh my God, we are literally burning the planet as a way of proving our love for a coin. Right? And proving that we believe in the value of the Bitcoin.
False idol. Right.
You had a particular way of framing it, didn't you? Which was like burning reality for a digital symbol. I was like, that hit me straight in the forehead.
Which is exactly what we're doing. We're burning real oil, real little dead animals, little squished animals, our precious resource that we have to make campfires or whatever we really want to do, right? We're burning the real world in the name of a symbol system, in the name of a digital number.
On the other hand, in Germany, we're not all as unenlightened as America. In Germany, the 300,000 member union of the metal workers just won a 22-hour work week for work-life balance at the same salary they had before, because they forced them with their united union. And I think that is the way to go. We've got to have downtime and slack, as you say.
Well, I think it was interesting because there's a bit where you're talking about the Social Dilemma book, and was it Naomi Wolf
documentary?
Sorry, documentary. And is it Naomi Wolf is
teaching
students, and she sort of plays them.
Naomi Klein. She's not in it, but she showed the movie in her class. So for people who don't know, Social Dilemma is a movie about a whole bunch of very wealthy tech bros who finally had the sudden realization of what we've been telling them for the last 30 years, which is that they are desocializing people through these technology, that they're really bad for people, that if you create a feedback loop between an algorithm and a human being, and the algorithm is doing nothing but trying to get engagement, it's going to create a negative feedback loop and make people more extreme versions of themselves or of their most sensationalist self. And Naomi Klein showed it to her students. She's a kind of great Marxist media teacher. And her students, their response right away was, haven't these guys ever heard of capitalism? Like they're willing to criticize everything but their business model. And that's because they're all still heavily invested in the companies that they're now critiquing. And it's kind of odd. And not that this is all about capitalism. Capitalism is also could be looked at as a symptom of this mindset, of a particular dominator mindset, one that sees the world as something to insulate oneself from rather than engage with.
Can I just sort of take a left turn? Because I think in terms of, it's just something that really made me laugh. You referred to TED Talks as gaslighting for the greater good. Or like, at least that's the perception of the people holding the TED Talks.
Yeah. What are they, ideas worth spreading, is their theme, and it's like, it's always, almost always some guy in a little red circle, here's the problem, here's the way I figured it out, and here's the great solution. So now just all do this. And it's it's so consonant with this sort of moonshot mentality that Google has and X Prize has and Elon Musk has, and even now the MacArthur Foundation. We're going to give $100 million to the best idea for saving everything. And it's not a moonshot single one great fix it. There is no big fix. There's millions of little fixes, and they all come about from people feeling less afraid of other people, more willing to engage socially, and more willing to realize that, no matter what Marlo Thomas and Oprah Winfrey told us when we were growing up, better civics doesn't necessarily happen from holding our hands and loving everybody around the world. Real civics is being responsible to and for people that you don't agree with, that you may not even like. It's not, you know what I mean? As psychologists, it's not about liking your parents. It's about knowing how to live with them and knowing how to get along with these people that, of course, you're not going to like everything about them. That's what resilience is. It's okay to have to tolerate the other, and to move into those difficult spaces with people. It's not all, fun and roses. It's hard.
Yeah.
It's engagement.
Right. Yeah.
It's social engagement, which, as it turns out, that connection, that social engagement on every level, from the world level to the individual level, is a basis of mental health. Certainly, and it's not the pills they're selling you.
No. But between the pills and the ability to swipe left on anything you don't want to know or anyone you don't want to engage with, you cannot swipe left on reality. And the more you swipe left on it, the more brittle you become. It's like you've got to give a child lots of different tastes, or they become really, like my kid, they become really narrow. They want the chicken fingers, ketchup, burgers. And, if you don't, you've got to stretch a little bit, and again, it's this idea that because they have these technologies, they've given themselves more and more choice over everything. And, and they're choosing one very particular thing. They're choosing, their friggin' spaceships. They're choosing to get away. They're choosing isolation. And what I'm trying to do is to help people, and that's part of Slack even, is, no, wait a minute. Rather than choosing something different, what if you choose to be right here, right now with who is here? Can't be with the one you love the one you're with. And how does that go? And that's the way you grow up, but these are children. These are adult billionaire children who want to just put their fingers in their ears, not hear about this and that, and get, soldiers, armies of little Gamergate kids to support them in their accelerationist takedown of the rest of the world.
Yep.
Yeah, and
I don't think that's necessarily just tech. I think it's like corporate.
It's not. It's not. But they represent. I mean, the reason I wrote a book about them is because I think they represent almost the clearest example. They are at on the one hand, they are role models for so much. They are the wealthiest, most successful people in the world who have built the platforms and vehicles and apps on which all of us are living. So they created our environment with their sensibility. So their environments, Facebook, virtual reality, and Musk tech, they all engender this highly individualistic, devil-may-care attitude that externalizes the harm to the enslaved people who build them and the enslaved people who deal with the toxic fallout. And that is increasingly us.
Right. And also that as you said sort of towards the end, that the bunker is ultimately a metaphor for the sort of disconnected approach to life that they have, right. and that they are spreading, or that, it just exists in our sort of shared culture.
Which it does. Like, and COVID happens in America. And what do people do? They build little COVID bubbles.
The aquapreneurs made me piss myself. I thought that was fucking hilarious. I'd never heard aquapreneurs, their idea is to build, they can't really get off the planet. So they're building these they call it seasteading. They build these rafts that float out into the ocean, and then they connect their rafts to other people's, and they establish nations that way, where they can have their own rules. So people like, Peter Thiel and Musk want to get their own nations out there so they can do, develop tech development of like genetics and cloning and nano and all this stuff you're not allowed to do in countries now. It's like they get their freedom by again, like leaving us behind.
Into international waters and right.
Yeah. But that was, that's the big irony that you sort of identified as well, that the I can't remember what it's called, like the Cyberspace Manifesto or whatever it's called, and just that idea of like there is no nations here, right? Like we are in cyberspace and we're free, and like how that's actually just come full circle as like, the company's like, we're not a nation, we're bigger than that, we're better than that,
right?
And just
and
the
free is individual. It is not we are free. It's I am free. It's a very different thing, because the we is gone, even though it's crucial. It's gone.
And even exactly. It's iPhone. iPad, it's me. Right. And then, when you can't be, it's interesting. So it's like, while Freud pushed the individual into the subconscious and the individual inside the individual, these guys in their quest for individual freedom, they go meta, which is, Facebook's new company, Meta, is literally one level above. Everything they say you've always got to go one exponential level above the rest. Or, with Zuckerberg, you've got to go one level up into virtual reality. And that's this new weird freedom of the individual, the goggle wearing individual, to level up. And again, you level up in order to leave everyone else behind. You're up in the augmented next level reality.
Right. Yeah. And it's that whole idea of like capital looking for places to, resource, to mine, to expand, and that the digital being this, not new anymore, but this space where like you can expand for infinity, like there is no limit. And that definitely is sort of scary, but I think because of all the consequences that could come from that, like, but
there is the limit. I mean, and it's the same limit that Marx identified in industrialism. The limit is human time and attention, because it's still, even though we're considered consumers instead of labor, consumption is just another form of labor at this point. It doesn't make anybody happy. It's awful. I hate consuming. And I've got and most people have more than enough. You need food and air, but all this shit we don't need. But the surface area is limited by humans, and that's why we all feel so stretched stretched so thin. That's why we have no attention to give ourselves or our loved ones anymore.
Also, we're distracted by misery and disconnection. And in the United States, it's the end of the American dream. Where are we? And no voice to know where to find oneself. It's very lonely.
Yeah, it's interesting. We've come up to the hour, so I don't know how much more time anyone has.
How did you want to? What's a good way to bring this to a happier close? I would say, I mean, for me, the happier close is it does though. I mean, or at least where do we do about this? And I think there are a lot of people in despair, and right now, the very best manipulators of that despair are people like Steve Bannon or Donald Trump, who know how to give young men the illusion of an uncastrated male authority figure who they can follow and get what they deserve again. Or they are really good at othering women or brown people or Jews, for that matter, as part of the conspiracy that's leading to this unhappiness. It's the way, a fascist can stay in power even though people are getting poorer and less happy. All the fascist has to say, it's not me, it's these ones or those ones who are stealing everything. We've got to go get them. So we need to, I believe, we don't need to get people to do this or get people to do that, which is more the propagandist's take, but we need to offer people social alternatives to this. And that does involve engaging with your community. And I know the examples I use are limited, whether it's, tutoring or throwing parties or teaching yoga in the park, but it is getting out and engaging with the others and creating opportunities for civic engagement and social connection. And people do it. We're going to have more and more opportunities as the hurricanes and climate change and all that comes. We're going to have more and more great opportunities to lay sandbags and dig people out of the mud and feed families that are destitute. And those activities are the ones where we do share common goals. And it really doesn't matter at that point if you're a Trumpy or an AOC fan, because you're doing the same thing. And we have 99% of human activity is that, not which one we like to watch on TV. So I would say, with whatever time you have, whenever you're feeling despondent, go outside, find other people, engage in your community, in the if it's a school board or the zoning board or the Chamber of Commerce. Our towns are crumbling, and they're not just crumbling because government isn't taking care of it, but because we've forgotten how civics works. And the only way to do it is to get out and do it.
And even economically, to have co-ops is a better way of doing it than have somebody profit, have us all involved.
Of course,
on every level.
Could go to a platform co-op. Go to the platform cooperative website, and you'll see it's really easy. Rather than sell your business to the market, sell your business to your employees. There's great ways to transition to a cooperative economy that lead to more long-term sustainable economic outcomes for the business owner and the community in which the business is operating.
Together.
Awesome. Right. That's a great way to end it all. Yep. Thank you very much, Douglas, for taking the time to do this.
Thank you.
Really enjoyed the chat and really enjoyed the book. And, I'll continue to listen to Team Human podcast. And, Find the Others has been a good motto. That's why I'm here.
Right.
Yes, me too.
Massive thank you as always to our VIP patrons: Alex Placito, Bruce Rogers Vaughan, Jennifer Cox, Justin Harper, Rebecca Johns, Seamus O'Connell, and Sheena Belmas.
If you have enjoyed anything you've heard Harriet say in this program, you will definitely enjoy Capitalism Hits Home, which is a solo program that Harriet does through Democracy at Work, which is a worker-owned cooperative that produces other great programs such as Economic Update with Richard Wolff and the Anti-Capitalist Chronicles with David Harvey. I can't recommend enough that everyone also listen to Capitalism Hits Home if you enjoy It's Not Just in Your Head.
And you can hear more from Harriet on her radio show called Interpersonal Update. It's on WBAI at 2:30 EST on Wednesday afternoons and in the WBAI archives.